Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening and welcome back to Cross Question. We've had a bit of a pause for obvious reasons, but we are back and we will continue to be broadcasting Cross Question at 8 o'clock every Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday evening. And do remember, you can watch us on Global Play, and if you'd like to ask our panel a question, the number 0345 6060 973. And if you miss an episode, you can catch up on the Cross Question podcast or Global Play or the YouTube channel. Now, we have with us over the next hour Harriett Baldwin, Conservative MP for West Worcestershire, Sarah Olney is Liberal Democrat MP for Richmond Park and the party spokesperson for Treasury and Business and Industrial Strategy, Hazel Blears, former Labour MP and Cabinet Minister under Gordon Brown, who's now chair of the Cumbria Healthier Community Partnership, and Charles Moore, Lord Moore, columnist for the Daily Telegraph, its former editor and a non-affiliated peer.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Before we go to the first question, Sarah Olney, I'm going to commiserate with you because I know what a blow it was to cancel the Liberal Democrat conference, which I'm sure non-Liberal Democrats really won't care. But it is that one opportunity for the year where people can get together. It raises a lot of money for party funds as well with the exhibition. And it's not something that you can organise for later in the year, really, is it?
No, we looked at lots of possibilities. We were hoping just to delay or maybe hold a bit of it, but nothing really was possible within the constraints of the morning period. And it really is. It would have been our first in-person conference since the 2019 general election. And so I can't tell you how much everybody was looking forward to it. Certainly all the MPs who were elected at that election have not had conference as MPs yet. And there's so much to talk about right now. Post-COVID, with the situation in Ukraine, there are so many, we get together, we really talk about policy at our conference and we pass motions and it's a really, really involved and it's really important for activists and for members. So it's a massive blow. Absolutely the right thing to do. I don't think anyone was in any doubt about that, but it is incredibly disappointing.
And Charles, of course, you come from a Liberal family, don't you?
Yes, I do. And I just want to sympathise with Sarah because I really cut my political teeth at the Liberal assemblies in the 1960s and early 70s. I was even a delegate a couple of times. Excellent. And I learnt two things from it. I think one is that how exciting politics can be, but secondly, I'm afraid that I didn't really want to be in the Liberal Party.
Well, it's surprising, isn't it, how many politicians start out as Liberal Democrats?
I was a member of the Liberal Party for 6 months in 1978.
You're in good company.
Until I heard a speech by Margaret Thatcher. Then that was it for me. Any Liberal connections, Hazel Blears?
Not Liberal connections, but I've just cast my mind back to when I was chair of the Labour Party, and obviously had to go to a conference and be in charge of all the arrangements. And the nights when I was up till kind of 2, 3 a.m, not having a drink and dancing, but negotiating with the National Policy Forum and the trade unions, I was very glad that those days are behind me.
Any Liberal connections, Harriett?
No, I was once on the receiving end of a Liberal Democrat target campaign, though, so
we've all been
that did not endear me to the party, no.
It worked for you, though. Right, let's go to our first question. It's from Simon in Wootton-under-Edge, which I've never heard of. Simon, where is Wootton-under-Edge?
It's in Gloucestershire, Ian, very on the edge of the Cotswolds and very near where Prince Charles or King Charles now lives at Highgrove, which leads on to my question.
Go on, then.
Now that the official period of national mourning is over, is it finally appropriate and finally time to have a discussion about the future of the monarchy?
Well, I have to say I've resisted that over the course of the last 10 days. I just didn't think it was appropriate on the radio, but I suspect it is now. Charles Moore, you're the nearest thing we've got to a constitutional historian here, so I'm going to go to you first.
Well, I think it's, apart from periods of mourning, it's always a reasonable question to raise. But I think that there's no rush, and people won't think about this in a very rational way at this moment. And I think there's a danger of causing, even after the mourning is finished, an unnecessary offence. And it seems to me that what's very clear coming out of this period of mourning is the strength of feeling in favour of the monarchy from all classes and colours and ages. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't raise the question of republic if you believe in it. Of course you should. But I think let's take this calmly.
Hazel, Blears, I think one of the interesting phenomena over the past 2 weeks has been the number of people who've said, well, I'm not a monarchist. In fact, if anything, I'm a Republican, but I've been really affected by the Queen's death, which I wasn't expecting to hear. And I wonder whether that will have a longer-term influence on this whole debate.
I think that's very personal to the Queen. I think there's a kind of feeling that she was there for 70 years, which is an amazing period of time. She's lived through history, she's lived through the ups and downs, the war, all of this, and people could actually relate to the Queen. I think it might be more difficult for the King, and we'll see how that plays out. Like you, I think if you want to have a debate, then you should have a debate. We live in a democracy and people are entitled to voice their opinions. I think it's a little bit too soon. I think the private mourning's, in fact, still happening for another week. So at least for another week. But I think it's a debate worth having. And we should be mature enough, grown up enough to look at different models of the way in which we govern ourselves. But I think for the Queen, she was a very special person. And I think that's been shown the last few weeks, how the British public actually regard her. She's not a kind of inherited despot. She's somebody who did understand people's lives.
Any Queen anecdotes? You must have met her.
I met her quite a few times as a Privy Councillor, and she was always gracious and polite. But what did make me smile, I think it was probably the first time I went and I was very nervous, and the Queen's very clear when she's heard enough from you.
How does this manifest itself?
You say your words and that's fine, and she nods, and then when she's had enough, she has a bell and she goes ting and your time's up.
Okay.
Which is fine.
Maybe I ought to have one of those on here.
I do think the last
Harriett.
2 weeks where we've seen both a change of Prime Minister and a change of monarch have really underlined to me how incredibly lucky we are to live in this democracy that is also a constitutional monarchy, because it's shown that we can peacefully pass power in this way. And you only have to look around the world to see that there are very few countries that would be able to make those kinds of changes in the peaceful way with the consent of the people that we've seen in the last 2 weeks.
Okay, Sarah?
I think what's been extraordinary, I think, about the last 10 days, quite apart from the personal reaction we've all had to the death of the Queen, and I think you're right, I think it took a lot of people by surprise how strongly they felt about it. But I think it's been really fascinating to observe how our constitution works in practice. For so many of us, it's just been largely theoretical, because we've known, obviously, that once the Queen died, the throne would pass to Charles, but to actually watch it happen in real time has been really, really interesting. And I think for a lot of people, it really did underpin the value of a constitutional monarchy, that we've always known it was going to be Charles who would follow the Queen, and that happened. And as Harriett said, very little disruption, very little difficulty. So I think probably we've all got a renewed understanding and a renewed appreciation of how well that works. But absolutely, we should be discussing whether that's still what we want. But I think the thing is, obviously, to as great an extent as possible, we want to take that away from the personalities. It's not about, is King Charles going to be a good king or not? It's about, is monarchy the right way to run our country, the right underpinning for our constitution? So I think maybe now is a difficult time to have that conversation, simply because we are looking at King Charles as a person and wondering what kind of monarch he's going to be. And maybe we do need to give him a bit of time to get his feet under the table, get the crown on his head, whatever it is he needs to do, but so that we can have that discussion without bringing the personalities into it.
It is interesting, though, that the Australians and New Zealanders have both been talking about this. And the Australian Prime Minister is a Republican, the New Zealand Prime Minister is a Republican, and she was even talking about it, I think, the day before the funeral, which I thought I slightly winced at. But I mean, it's going to be very interesting to see, Charles, whether the Commonwealth survives in its current form, isn't it? I mean, the Queen is not head of state of every Commonwealth country, but or wasn't. But I think there's going to be a debate about the whole future there too.
There will be some, but I think it's important to realise that the way the system works is it's so instantaneous, so that the dangerous moment of transition actually is rather not so dangerous, because it happens. And so the King is already King of Australia and New Zealand. It's not a debate about whether he is going to be, he is. and just as much as he's the king here. And he's already the head of the Commonwealth, because it's one of the things that the Queen arranged at the Commonwealth Conference in London a few years ago, that he would be the next head of the Commonwealth, which was by no means a given. And so he is. And I think that's important, because that gives a certain security. And I noticed that even the New Zealand and Australian prime ministers, who, as you say, are themselves Republicans, they're not actually pushing it that hard. They wish to maintain the Republican constituency. They may do something about it, but I don't see a sort of floodgate of this opening.
And there's a distinction, if I may, between the Commonwealth, where the king is head of state in only a subset of the Commonwealth countries, and the Commonwealth has actually been expanding. The debate that people are having is whether or not they still want King Charles as head of state or to be a monarch.
It's about
but it's different from being in the Commonwealth. There are now
Countries,
56 Commonwealth countries, so they've just added 2 more at the last Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. So that's a growing family of nations that are just aligned in terms of the things that they believe in.
It's been quite interesting to sort of observe the transition, because as Charles says, there wasn't a transition. The Queen dies and then the King is immediately there. And I still find it weird to say the King, or when it's not QC anymore, it's KC, and all sorts of little things. Do you think, Hazel, that we're now going to embark on a period of national introspection and think, well, what kind of country are we? I think most people would agree the funeral ceremony, the whole day, showed this country maybe in its best light. It was a brilliant feat of organisation. But we don't just want to be known for being able to do pageantry well, do we?
Well, absolutely, that's the point. The pageantry was amazing, but the challenges that we're likely to face in the coming months, in terms of the cost of living, the energy prices, all the things hopefully that we're going to talk about today, this is in a completely different place to having, if you like, an introspective conversation about constitutional matters. I think there are going to be some really big challenges for all of us to face, and just to be having a constitutional conversation at this point, I don't think there's going to be space in the national debate for that, because these issues are going to affect real people in real time.
And we're about to move on to talk about some of those real issues. Very good link there. You should have a job in radio, Hazel. Keep your calls coming at 0345 6060 973. You're listening to or watching LBC's Cross Question with me, Iain Dale. It's 8:15.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
17 minutes past 8. With me on the cross-question panel are Harriett Baldwin, Conservative MP for West Worcestershire, Sarah Olney, Liberal Democrat MP for Richmond Park, Hazel Blears, former Labour Cabinet Minister, and Charles Moore, Lord Moore, non-affiliated peer. What does this non-affiliated mean? It's a slightly awkward phrase.
It's much too arcane to be really worth explaining, but it is like a sort of small subsection of crossbenchers.
Right. It just means you don't have to obey a whip.
From my point of view, I was very keen not to be attached to a party, because I think it's difficult if you're a journalist for that to happen.
Right. Let's go to our next question. Mike is in Beverley. Hello, Mike.
Good evening, Ian. Yes, my question for the panel is, does the panel think that tax changes that benefit the well-off in society more than the poorest in society is the way forward in a modern Britain?
And that's what you imagine is going to happen on Friday in this so-called fiscal event, that they will announce tax cuts which benefit the better off?
Yeah, and when Liz Truss was questioned about this, is it fair, she quite simply said, yes, it is.
Harriett Baldwin, I don't think you supported Liz Truss, did you, in the
I've gone from
contest?
backing the runner-up in the previous leadership election to backing the candidate who came third. So I was a Penny Mordaunt supporter. So I'm sort of downwardly mobile in politics.
Which explains why you didn't get the ring to be a minister again, I suspect. But there we go. So what do you think about this? Because the kind of tax cuts that Liz Truss seems to be contemplating, of course we don't know yet, in theory would benefit those who you might think, well, they don't need to be benefited.
Well, as you say, we don't know yet. So what she campaigned on was reversing the national insurance rise that was put through, that was effectively breaking one of our manifesto pledges. So she's committed to winding that back. And she's also committed not to increasing corporation tax. And I'm expecting those two things to be announced on Friday, but we don't know yet.
And do you support them?
I can support both of those measures because, the other ones, it would kind of hold your nose because they were breaking manifesto pledges. And I think the rationale behind them is that we grow the pie so that we help the whole economy, and the economy itself grows faster than it would have done if we hadn't done it. So I think there's a lot of logic in that. Whether it will happen immediately or whether you can actually measure what the difference would be, that will be something we will argue about, I think, on your programme for many months to come. But I think the approach has been very clearly outlined. For me, what I'll be looking at as a member of the Treasury Select Committee, is what the impact is on the inflationary pressures and whether we can get those down, because I think that's the biggest robbing factor in our economy at the moment, in terms of robbing the poorest the most as well. And we've got to get inflation under control.
If you want to get economic growth going, which seems to be the main thing that Liz Truss is concerned by, surely it would be better to stimulate the people at the lower end of the economy who don't have a huge amount of disposable income. If you gave someone on universal credit the equivalent, I don't know, £2,000 or whatever, they would be spending that money in this country on things that wouldn't necessarily be inflationary.
I think that's incredibly important too. And of course, there have already been a lot of those measures that have been announced. So I think it's going to be looking at what's already been announced, combined with what's going to be announced on Friday, which we're all speculating about, to see in the round what impact that has. But I completely agree with you that for those who don't have the capacity to earn anymore, for example, pensioners, that's going to be an important part of the segment of the economy to help that we get through this winter. And bear in mind that there will be the other element of the package, which is around the energy prices. And there I do think we have to acknowledge that Putin has weaponized the price of energy against the West. And he's trying to weaken our resolve to stand up to him by putting up the price of gas this winter. And we will not allow that to happen. And that's why we've got to protect people from that element of a weapon that Putin has basically directed against the poorest in our society.
Hazel Blears, I think I heard a little bit of sighing during some of Harriett's answer there.
Well, not aimed at you personally, Harriett, at all. But I think I read in the papers that reducing the national insurance and corporation tax is going to benefit the poorest people, poorest families in this country by 63 pence a month. Now, we are facing inflation, the like of which we've not seen for, 30, 40 years. We're facing a cost of living crisis. We're living in a country where not only does virtually every area now have a food bank. That wasn't happening when I was growing up, and I grew up in, not great circumstances. But now we're talking about warm hubs where we can heat places, communal places, so people can go and keep warm in the winter. We've got kind of a soup kitchen together with a place where you can huddle round a fire. We live in a 21st century, modern, industrialised country. What is going on?
Sarah?
Well, I think Liz Truss saying that we've absolutely got to go for growth and having the target 2.5% growth. I mean, that's something I think everybody can agree with. But I'm really doubtful that her plans for tax cuts are going to achieve, everything she wants them to achieve. I think we've got to be looking much more at investing in our green economy, specifically in renewable energy, to overcome some of the issues that Hazel and Harriett were both raising about our energy security. We need to be upskilling people to take on jobs in the green economy, and I think that can address a lot of what you were saying about the inequality, that actually we have got a really, really economically unequal society. And I think it was the Resolution Foundation in a report they published over the summer. And I haven't got the figures exactly in my mind, so I don't want to say in case I get it wrong, but the level of the standard of living of the poorest in our country is so much worse than the poorest in our European neighbours. That's something we've urgently got to address. And you're absolutely right to say if we make a difference at that level, that can make a much greater impact on growth overall than just benefiting the richest. So, I mean, we would support a cut in national insurance. We've been calling for that since the spring. I think we want to put money back in the pockets of households while times are really, really tough. We also need to see an increase in universal credit. We need to restore that £20 a week that they were getting during lockdown. But that's the sort of thing I just don't think, for example, that removing the cap on bankers' bonuses is going to do anything like as much for the economy as a whole, for the poorest in our society, as Liz Truss seems to think it will.
Charles Moore, Joe Biden was quite animated today when he was criticising trickle-down economics. And essentially a lot of the things that Liz Truss seems to be wanting to do would fall under that category, wouldn't they?
Yes, I'm not sure it's the most helpful phrase, really. I think what you have to think of what the context here is, which is that in recent years, the Conservatives tend to win because they don't want the government to run the economy. And in recent years, the government has run the economy and spent much, much more. And that's to do largely with the COVID. And now it's to do with the extraordinary energy situation. But it was also, Conservatives should admit, to do with Boris's incredible prodigality with spending compared with what most Conservative Prime Minister would do. So I think Liz Truss is trying to redress that balance. Most Conservatives do believe that the way people in general get richer is through being able to get rewards for their own efforts rather than being directed by the government. And therefore, they want to stimulate the economy that way rather than by the government doing yet another thing and, quote, investing in something. And I think that is broadly the right way to go. I'm not absolutely convinced whether the corporation tax change is going to make such a difference, for example. I'm slightly sceptical on some of this, but I think the overall position is the right one. And people should remember that when it was a great discovery of the 1980s, which remains the case, that when you cut taxes on at the top level, the Treasury actually gets more money in. Now, we haven't actually cut taxes at the top level yet, but it is a simple fact that if the top rate is 40%, at present it's 45%, but it used to be 80%, actually more money comes in. So that must be, to use a cliche, a win-win situation. If you're charging high earners less and you're getting more out of them, something good is happening. And I think we're moving towards that. The risk Liz Truss is taking is about confidence, market confidence. And I think she's probably right to do so. I think we do need a sort of fillip. We do need to be quite bold about this. We do need to stop having to say no all the time. But there is a danger that people will think, well, how is this going to work? Are the sums we've been able to borrow very cheaply as a government for years and years now, will we be able to in the future? And she's taking a calculated risk, but it is a calculated one, not a crazy one.
Right. Let's take another question. Thank you very much for your question there, Mike. Let's take another question from Anthony in Staines. It's on Liz Truss again. Hello, Anthony.
Hello, Ian. Hello, panel. If ex-Trade Minister Liz Truss finds herself unable to get a trade deal with America, may she count herself a failure?
Well, she's made very clear today that there isn't any prospect of a trade deal with America in the short to medium term. Her words, not mine, which is quite something when you think about it. Sarah, let's start with you. The government have done trade deals with individual US states, quite a lot of them, but it's not the same as having a deal with the whole country, is it?
No. And I mean, I think what this is not some big announcement. Really, this is just a statement of reality that many people have known for a long time. Our interests and US interests in trade are fundamentally not aligned, and it was always going to be.
Why do you say that? Because the sector of our trade is with the US.
I think the big sectors that America are looking, or the US are looking for to open up markets in, are agriculture and healthcare. And we have particular interests in protecting our domestic agriculture, particularly on things like welfare standards. And obviously, we want to protect our NHS. So that's why I say it's misaligned. I don't say that there's no opportunities there at all, but it was never going to be straightforward. And I think that's just the reality that Liz Truss is now, acknowledging, because I don't think the fundamentals have changed at all since 2016. But I do think it is a big worry, because what we are experiencing right now, I think, is some of the worst trade deficit we've had. I think I'm right in saying on record, and what that's doing to sterling, of course, is making inflation so much worse for everybody. We import a lot of food and fuel, and when sterling is weak, it makes everything more expensive. So that's becoming a real driver of inflation. So something has to be done to improve our current balance of trade. And I think in a way, it's positive that, as I say, we're recognising the reality of our trading position with the US. But it does raise the question, well, where are we going to? How are we going to improve our trade position? And I think that's very much an open question at the moment.
Charles, this was always touted by people on the pro-Brexit side of the argument as one of the major Brexit gains, that we would be able to do trade deals not only with the United States but lots of other countries too. But it seems as though it's not going to happen with the United States. Now, you can blame the Biden administration for not particularly being very keen on it as well. And then you have John Redwood, one of the arch-Brexiteer, who says, well, we don't need trade deals with countries that we already trade successfully with. I don't remember him saying that in 2016. Maybe he did.
Actually, I think John Redwood did say that, and I remember, I couldn't swear to that, but I remember Daniel Hannan, for example, saying that the idea that you have to have a trade deal to trade is a very sort of strange government-oriented idea. Basically, people trade. Trade deals can have advantages, they can have disadvantages, but there's tons of countries in the world we don't have trade deals. Most countries in the world we don't have trade deals. We trade with them. I don't think it's as major an issue either way as people imagine.
So what were the benefits from Brexit if it wasn't to be able to do our own trade deals? Because that was the major one in the Leave campaign. No,
I think that's wrong. It was that we would be in a position to trade competitively with the world, which is not the same thing. And in the membership of the European Union, we had no rights about our trade. We delegated whole of our trade to the European Commission, and therefore we weren't able to compete in our own terms. We had to, obviously that gets you mass power, a section of mass power, but it also makes you inflexible. And I think the trouble that we've been in since Brexit about this is largely to do with the fact that we haven't actually completed it. So we are still shadowing and we can see it very clearly in the extreme example of the Northern Ireland Protocol. We are sort of shadowing the EU structures which we've left. And they remain, to a large extent, in our law. Okay. And there's a lot more to be done. We have to diverge, and the whole concept of being in the European Union was to converge. And the Theresa May mistake was to try and let us be out, but still converge. We have to diverge. I'm going to ask Hazel and Harriett to answer it
after the news. You've got a couple of minutes more to think about your incisive and brilliant answers. It's 8:31. Let's get the LBC News headlines from Lottie Morley.
Vladimir Putin is expected to address the Russian people for the first time since his soldiers invaded Ukraine in February. There's speculation he could try to hold referendums in areas his soldiers are occupying and attempt to annex them. The Prime Minister says she's prepared to be unpopular as her Chancellor gets ready to give a mini-budget on Friday. Liz Truss says she doesn't accept that cutting taxes is unfair and insists her priority is growing the economy. And fresh rail strikes could cause major disruption for commuters heading to the London Marathon and the Tory party conference. The RMT and ASLEF unions have announced walkouts next Saturday, affecting 16 operating companies. LBC weather, outbreaks of rain pushing in from the west this evening and a low of 7 degrees.
LBC. Play. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:35. Harriett, Baldwin, Sarah Olney, Hazel, Blears and Charles Moore with us answering your calls. 0345 6060 973. Hazel is very keen for a question on health for reasons best known. Well, I know why she wants one on health because that's kind of what she does nowadays. But anything that you'd like to ask, 0345 6060 973. Now, we were in the middle of answering a question about Liz Truss and the trade deal with America. Now, Harriett Baldwin, you were a Treasury Minister, you were a Foreign Office Minister. It was always a key aim of the government to get a trade deal with America, and yet Liz Truss basically has bit of defeat now.
I think the US and the UK, we are very, very close allies. We are the biggest investors in each other's economies. There is an enormous trading relationship. But I'm all in favour of trying to break down those barriers, increase trade further. I'm very pleased that when Liz Truss was International Trade Secretary, she managed to open up for my farmers in Worcestershire the lamb market in North America and also the beef market, and tackled some of the tariffs on things like whiskey and steel. But I do think that there would be advantages to both economies. In fact, ironically, I think it would be the US economy that would benefit even more from a free trade deal. I think we've got to continue working at it, continue to try to break down barriers for our businesses here in the UK and export more to America.
Hazel?
Well, dare I say, as a recovered politician, I think what Liz Truss has done is...
you said recovered, not recovering.
No, a recovered politician, totally. Liz Truss has done the kind of trick, if you like. You know, she's discounting it now because she knows that it's not going to work. So, you know, credit to her for doing that. But then the second part of the question was, you know, will she be a political failure? I think she's got a lot more on her plate to be a political failure about than the trade deal with the US, frankly, because the way our economy is going and the problems that we're all going to face, you know, the public are going to be up in arms about the issues, the challenges that they and their families are going to be facing. So I think the US trade deal in macroeconomics is obviously very important. But in terms of how people feel about her as the new Prime Minister in a new government, I think she's going to be on pretty shaky territory.
OK, David in Horsham says, why do we only focus on the economics of Brexit? I voted to leave because I don't want to be part of the United States of Europe, which is where the EU is headed. I was happy to accept there would be some economic consequences. Freedom does not have a price. And that, I mean, Charles Moore, that's an interesting perspective because it's one we don't hear very often because people always automatically assume that anybody who voted to leave the EU did so on the basis that everyone would be much better off and the land would be flowing with milk and honey.
Well, I would very strongly agree with David's position because I think it is fundamentally a question of whether you're an independent democratic country. But I don't want to get in the situation in which you say, OK, I'm delighted to be poorer. That's not the point of it. And there's no reason why we should be. And I think either way, the advantages of staying or leaving were economically quite marginal. It cuts both ways. But I think we're suffering now, partly because the global economy is suffering for all sorts of other reasons, and partly because, as I say, we've jolly well done Brexit in a sort of parliamentary and legal sense, but we haven't worked through the whole process. And by the way, I'm not surprised because it takes... As we built up in our membership, we built up a great accumulation, you know, the famous acquis communautaire, which grew and grew and grew. And that took a long time, and it's going to take quite a long time to get rid of that acquis.
Just by way of balance, Francis says, have Brexiteers no shame? Excuses after excuses. For God's sake, just admit you were wrong and the country can move on. I think we'll leave that one hanging, shall we, or treat it as a rhetorical question. Let's go to Evan in Slough. Evan, hello, what would you like to ask?
Hi, Ian. With the drive in the UK to close the energy gap with nuclear and green, if we produced all our own energy, based on current government policy, would the people in the UK, would we still need to pay 80% more for energy if we could produce all our own energy?
That's a complicated one. I'm glad I don't have to answer it.
This is given that we subsidised it.
I think the other point to make is that we're still exporting 27% of our gas to the EU at the moment because we haven't got the storage facility for it. So if we could actually use that ourselves, maybe prices wouldn't be so high. Hazel?
Well, I think it's a great question. Obviously, for us to be completely self-sufficient and to be generating surplus, then we need to look at a much wider range of ways of getting our energy. I've been quite disappointed in the past at the unwillingness to go for nuclear. Boris Johnson has been a big champion of nuclear, and obviously I now live in Cumbria. We've got a lot of really good experience in terms of nuclear. The small modular reactors that Rolls-Royce are pushing now, you know, they're not the great big monoliths, but actually they could really add to our energy supply. The offshore wind that we've got, you know, that we need to build up. All of these are ways in which we can not just be self-sufficient, but we could actually be providing energy for
why
others.
didn't the government that you were a member of go nuclear?
Some people say it did go nuclear, but not in that way. but some time ago, and I think sometimes people were really frightened of the nuclear thing, because of its association with weaponry and all of those things. But actually, producing clean energy in a way that would really benefit this country, with the safety considerations, the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, fantastic way of disposing, processing the products, that kind of thing. It's much, much safer now. And if you look at that balance between what energy is going to cost us and the way in which we could be self-sufficient and be exporting energy as well, I think the balance has changed in recent years.
I suppose the point in my question was that if the Blair government in particular had commissioned nuclear power stations, they would be coming on stream now. And there was that whole period, and Cameron government was equally to blame as well, where virtually nothing was done. And some people did see the consequences of that. I've said on the programme before, Liam Fox, I remember in 2014, was banging on about energy security, and my eyes glazed over, but they shouldn't have done, because he was absolutely on the money. Do you not think that was a major error of the Blair and Brown governments?
Well, I agree that people were too cautious about it, and it was perhaps because of the connotations around nuclear, and a lot of us were brought up in CND and the movement and all of that. But actually, if you looked at it properly, intellectually, the case for nuclear energy is very, very powerful indeed. And I do think that we could have gone further in providing not just this country with security, but the opportunity to export and increase our economy through it.
Charles Moore, the French got ahead of us on this, didn't they? I think 75% of their energy needs at one point were coming from nuclear, not so much now. Why didn't we see the light?
Well, I'm not sure that, I agree with Hazel about nuclear, but I'm not sure this is really the key point. I don't think that self-sufficiency in itself is automatically what you need. But what we are suffering now very much from is a problem of security and of vulnerability. When we had lots of North Sea gas, we perfectly properly sold most of it. We didn't make our prices much, much cheaper. We made a lot of money by selling it. So it's not that you have to provide all your own energy, but what you have to have is the right mix, and you have to have the right storage, and you have to have the right capacity. And we've neglected all of those things, whether it's nuclear, whether it's going much too fast, I think, on green measures. And I think net zero has done tremendous harm to this, because it's set a particular date for a particular achievement, which is unreal and doesn't reflect what's actually going on, and it's putting everyone's prices up. And so now, when actually we really do need the energy, 2 weeks ago, my coal merchant, I buy coal, and my coal merchant came and said, "Do you want some coal? Because I'm going to be banned from selling it from March next year." So I got in a whole load of several tons of coal into my cellar, and it seems to be quite ridiculous that you can't buy coal, and all the fossil fuels, apart from anything else, in terms of the in the supply, the regularity of supply, you have to have fossil fuels, because otherwise, because of the intermittency problem, and you should make use of what you've got. And we neglected all these things because we chased after the god of net zero, and also because we just lived for the day and energy prices were cheap and we weren't thinking ahead. And Putin spotted this, as Harriett was rightly pointed out, and he is trying to hold the whole of the Western world. Britain's not suffering the worst in this, by the way, by any means, to ransom on this. Luckily, he's overreached. He's making an absolute mess of Ukraine. And also, I think his threat, though it's very severe in the short term, is fundamentally empty. So we are going to come through this. I don't believe energy prices are going to go on rising as much as people think. They've been horrific rising recently, but I actually don't think it's going to go on. And when we face him down, as I think we are now doing, we will come out the other side. But I'm afraid we had a pretty good energy policy about energy mix about 20 years ago, and it's gone completely haywire.
I'm going to ask for short answers from Sarah and Harriet. I don't know whether they'll be relieved for that or not. But Sarah.
Well, actually, I think one of the reasons we're really struggling at the moment is because we use so much gas in this country. And what we also really need to focus on is reducing our energy consumption. We need to really be insulating our homes. And I think that will, and if we could start with the lowest income families and a proper programme of insulation, we could make a real difference right now to how warm people's homes are going to be this winter. And I do think that's the bit which actually the government could affect much more quickly, much more effectively. We could upscale upskill, we could create loads of new jobs all over the country. We really need to be insulating homes, and that's the other way we can really address the amount of power and energy that we're all using.
Harriett, shouldn't there be public information adverts now, sort of saying, well, look, this is how you can reduce your energy usage? They're happening in Scandinavian countries. I saw one the other day. It was actually quite funny, but very informative. And there were things that I thought, oh, I've never thought of doing that. But we've seen nothing.
On the telly, you mean, or on the radio?
Yeah. Well,
I think you're talking your
radio,
book there,
obviously.
aren't you? Because there is quite a lot of good information out there on different websites, the energy savings trusts and things like that. But I'm actually going to slightly disagree with Charles's point, because I do think that we need to move past coal. I think that wind, which on certain days generates over half of the electricity in the United Kingdom, that's a good thing. I think obviously not every day is windy though, so we clearly do need to do what Hazel's advocated so strongly, which is have more nuclear baseload. But we can do this. We've just got to get through this really tough winter ahead, where Putin has really weaponised the gas price globally against the Western democracies.
Shall I give you an energy saving tip?
Okay.
Now, when we go away on holiday or you go away for the weekend, you switch all your house lights off, don't you? How many of you switch off your Wi-Fi?
Ooh,
yeah,
good
see?
point. Good
I've
point.
forgotten the password.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know how much that would save, but if we all did it, it would save a bit, I would have thought. Anyway, I always like to give some good public information out on this programme. It's 8:47.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
10 to 9 on LBC. Harriett Baldwin is here, Sarah Olney, Hazel Blears and Charles Moore taking your calls. We've got a text question now from June in Barnsley. Doctors are saying 16 million people could be left without a local GP in 10 years. The NHS is crumbling, but it keeps getting more and more funding. So why is it going so wrong? Hazel Blears, your moment has come.
Well, it is really, really struggling at the moment. And I think it's a fairly simple diagnosis, if I dare say. I think we need to move from treatment to prevention. And I say that as a former public health minister, when I was absolutely trying to change this system. And, more GPs, more funding, more money. The really important thing is that we try and give people some control over their own health, because you know your body better often than professionals necessarily will do. But at the moment, people have very little tools really to tackle some of this. And so if we want to prevent ill health, we need to get ahead of the curve and not simply wait for the treatment down the line. That means people need to know what is going wrong with them, whether it's mental health, physical health, the problems around obesity, excess alcohol consumption, all of these things. And up in Cumbria now, I think we've got a revolutionary blueprint for how we shift this system into prevention. We've got an organisation, Circular One Health. We're working with BAE Systems, who've got, a 50-year pipeline for the nuclear submarines. They need their workers to be healthy and fit and productive. So they're working with us. We're doing screening to look at blood pressure, cardiovascular, to look at lifestyle changes. And then it's not just the screening, it's then providing help for them, for people to tackle those kind of problems. Now, that is a very different model to simply going to the GP when you can't get an appointment, you can't get treatment done, you're waiting for an operation, and it's empowering people to take control over their own health. And for businesses, not just BAE, but for lots of big businesses, they want their workers to be productive. So there's a benefit in it for them. I call it doing good is good business. You do the right thing and you get some commercial return. You get less sickness, less long-term absenteeism. Do you know the figures for people on long-term sick went up in the last 3 months by 352,000 people. That's more than in the last 30 years. So it looks as if the unemployment figures are coming down. It's not that. People are not in work. They've gone off on long-term sickness. And so much of it is mental health and lifestyle changes. So unless we get ahead of that curve, start helping people to cope with this themselves, with some professional help, all we'll be doing is funneling more money, just as June said, into a system that isn't working. And people are having to wait for treatment all the time, getting worse and worse and getting more expensive to treat, because the longer you let it go on, you've then got to have acute and critical care, and that's hugely expensive.
Well, that sounds all very well and good, but where does individual responsibility come into this? I mean, you say that we all know our own bodies better than anybody else, and I think that is true. And most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, we also know what needs to be done to make our bodies more healthy. And yet we kind of sort of farm that out to somebody else to make a decision. So you go and see a doctor who says, well, you need to do this. And you think, well, actually, I already knew that, but I haven't done anything about it.
It's exactly my point. If you've had screening and you've got the numbers and you know what your blood pressure is and you know how much alcohol you're drinking and everything else, then it's your responsibility, with the help of professionals maybe, but your responsibility to yourself, to your family, to your community, to do something about it. And again, we don't make it easy for people, do we, to change their lifestyle? So we've got to be able to have that support and backup. But for me, it's always been this. Public health is moving from a medical model to a social model. We want to have world-class social prescribing. So instead of getting the tablets, you perhaps go on a walk, you meet other people, you tackle loneliness and isolation. World-class social prescribing in the arts, in sport, in nature can do more to give people a sense of health and well-being than many of the tablets and prescriptions that we dispense, and it's cheaper.
Harriett Baldwin.
Well, I think the picture that Hazel paints is very persuasive. I'm sitting here thinking, I'm not quite sure how we actually deliver that on the ground in West Worcestershire, so I shall be following with interest what you do up in Cumbria. I think that, what my constituents are concerned about is how difficult it is to get into primary care, to see their GP. I think many of my constituents are sitting on long-term waiting lists, and we've got to do more to increased capacity of the system to deal with that waiting list. And recently I was pleased that in my local hospital, where ambulance queues have been a massive issue, they've reorganised things in a way that does touch wood, seem to be working over the last 2 weeks. And I was pleased to see that the new Health Secretary, Therese Coffey, has put ambulance waits at really the top of her priority list, because that has been really clogging the system from people who haven't followed Hazel's advice. When I've been to A&E on a Saturday night, I've been absolutely stunned and shocked by seeing how much of it is alcohol related, actually. So if it works, do let us know, Hazel, because it sounds like a good vision.
Sounds like a new job for your constituent, Jackie Smith. She could be Hazel's equivalent. And I think she's got enough jobs.
I think she does Birmingham, doesn't she? Yeah.
Charles.
Yeah.
Well, I like what Hazel's saying about prevention, but she mentioned the system, and I think the first truth we have to acknowledge, and we are coming around to it more, but we still haven't really begun to get there, is that the National Health Service is a very bad system. And it's fundamentally always has been a very bad system, and it's got worse. And the reason for this is that it's what economists call, it suffers from what economists call producer capture. That's to say, it's designed by the bureaucrats and the people who run it, and it suits their convenience. I don't mean that they're bad or not hard-working people, but that's the type of system it is. It's a top-down system which offers no real choice to the patient. And this, we've been bugged by this problem for years because people say the alternative is, Wild West of the United States. Not the relevant comparison. We need proper studies of the health services in all civilized countries. And if we are the envy of the world, which we constantly say we are, why does no other Western system have a health service like ours except for Canada? Why are they all quite differently based? Often they're based on insurance things through, Hazel was talking about employers. They can be, in Australia, for example, they come through your employment. It provides most of your medical treatment. We are primitive and out of date, and therefore every time you encounter the system, and I'm afraid I've encountered a great deal with 3 generations of my family in the last 2 years, absolutely lamentable, not at pure medicine, but at looking after the patient, at connecting things up, at listening to what people are saying, at making sure the appointment's kept, at keeping the records straight, moving people from one hospital to another at the right moment, all that sort of thing. It's terrible. And every scene in an accident emergency every day is a disgrace. And it doesn't have to be like that. It's to do with...
You say that, and of course we all look at it from our own personal point of view. My experience when I fell off the stage in Buxton for the local A&E in Macclesfield was absolutely superb. It was nothing like Casualty on television at all. They were very calm, not rushing around, great care and attention. I couldn't have a single complaint.
Of course, there are marvellous staff in almost all these places, and of course, as a celebrity, and you might have got favoured treatment.
Surely not.
I'm not a celebrity, maybe I didn't.
But no, I mean, honestly, I've seen so often this problem, and it's often on things which don't seem very important in themselves, but when you accumulate it, particularly, say, for an old person, the whole of their lives, often when they're in their 80s, is dominated by, am I going to get this treatment? When am I going to get it? Why has the X-rays disappeared? All these type of questions. And this is not because of the negligence of individuals. It's to do with a systemic failure to run a proper system. And we should have a massive study, comparative study of the places that work better. Sweden, Germany, Australia, Netherlands, all sorts of them. And we can get something out of that. But we have to destroy the sort of false god of the beauty of the National Health Service.
Sarah?
I think the biggest issue that the NHS is currently facing is workforce. And I hear this every time I'm speaking to health leaders in my constituency. They are really, really struggling to fill vacancies. And that is what's causing the biggest problems. At the moment, I mean, a lot of the ambulance crisis, I wouldn't describe it as a crisis in southwest London, an ambulance challenge, but it's because they can't discharge patients because there's no social care, there's nobody to look after them. We don't have enough people in our social care workforce. And I think one of the bigger issues that we're facing in southwest London is around mental health provision, and particularly the time it takes to get that first appointment. And when I speak to local mental health leaders, it's not so much that they don't have the budget, they just cannot find the skilled people with the right kind of experience. So
I'm not surprised at £9.50 an hour for a social care worker.
Well, exactly, because they can get better jobs doing warehouse or retail or hospitality. Why would you do social care if you can earn better elsewhere? So I think workforce is the huge issue that we really, really do need to address. And I think the money's there. It's training, it's bringing people in, it's making it an attractive career for people, which I think is one of the main things. That workforce, I think, is the number one issue in the NHS at the moment.
Right, final question from Lucy in Portsmouth. Holly and Phil Charles, are you familiar with Holly and Phil? I'm wondering. Holly Willoughby and Philip Schofield from this morning have come under serious fire for, quotes, jumping the queue for the Queen. Actually, they did nothing of the sort, but anyway. Only in the UK could that be treated as such a crime. Which other British traits have been on show in the last 10 days? 20 seconds from each of you, starting with you, Harriett.
Well, I think what stuck with me was the amazing military bands and the military marching was just outstanding.
Bagpipe sticks in my mind. There was a lot of them yesterday, Charles.
Well, so I'd say an extraordinary thing, which is classlessness. When I watch these enormous queues, it's everybody. It's absolutely every type of person that you conceive of in this country, and some of them not from this country. It's the most end of generation, everything. It's the most remarkable thing.
We had Frank phone in last night, a 96-year-old born within a week of the Queen, who was at the Lion State of King George V and queued up for 8 hours to see Her Majesty. And I said to him, I think you're probably the only person in this country that can say that they've done that. And Nick Soames came on later and paid a massive tribute to Frank. It was just a magical moment. Sarah?
I think probably doing some of the pageantry and with such a straight face. I mean, some of it, some of the outfits that people are wearing and the breaking of the stick and all of this, and it's all terribly solemn. I mean, it was incredible. I really enjoyed watching it.
I must admit, I wasn't prepared for the breaking of the stick, but Hazel.
Well, my dad Arthur is not a bit like Frank. He's 93 and he's a confirmed Republican. But he has enjoyed watching the pageantry, I think, during this week. But I think the thing that stood out for me is it did feel like people were more equal. Everybody had to queue up. Everybody had to do their bit. And there is something about the British people about once you get us all together, the barriers kind of come down between us, whether it's class background or whatever, I don't know. And they were like, well, we're all in it together. And that was a lovely, warm feeling for me.
Harriett Baldwin, Sarah Olney, Hazel Blears and Charles Moore, thank you all very much for joining us on Cross Question this evening. We'll be back with another edition tomorrow. Coming up in a moment, I'm going to ask you, would you like a 4-day week? It's 9:02.